It's nearly impossible to summarize the Israeli-Palestinian conflict concisely, but if you're looking for the most potent symbol of the conflict, this place, right behind me, wins, hands down. Palestinians call it the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Jews know it as the Temple Mount. It's the holiest site in Judaism and the third holiest site in Islam, which makes it some of the most contested real estate in the world. It's every ancient stone used as proof, either of Israeli or Palestinian legitimacy. So who actually owns this land? And how did this site become the biggest flashpoint in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? No place encapsulates Jerusalem's turbulent history quite like the Temple Mount, whose iconic golden dome has come to define the city's skyline. This is where the stories and hopes and aspirations of three faiths converge. But if everyone claims it as their own, who does it really belong to? To answer that, we have to start at the beginning. And I mean the beginning. In Jewish tradition, the large flat stone in the middle of the Temple Mount complex is the center of the universe. This is where God breathed life into Adam, where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son, and where the Israelite king Solomon dedicated a temple to God 3,000 years ago. Temples were a dime a dozen in the ancient world, but not for the Jews, who had a single portable temple known as the Mishkan, which had been with them for hundreds of years since their wanderings in the desert after leaving Egypt. Solomon wanted to turn that portable temple into a permanent temple that could draw pilgrims from all over. See, at that time, the Israelites were the world's only monotheists, and their beautiful temple served as excellent PR for the one true God. So the king invested considerable resources to make the Jewish temple the destination for pilgrims of all nations. Solomon got his wish. Emperors and kings flocked to Jerusalem with offerings and gifts, and weapons, and imperial ambitions, and violence. Now it's starting to sound like the Jerusalem you're used to hearing about. For 400 years, Solomon's temple served as Judaism's focal point. Its fame extended to the distant corners of Europe and Africa. If Jerusalem was a prize situated at the crossroads of Asia and Africa, then the temple was its crown jewel. Here's the thing about prizes though. Everyone wants one, including the Neo-Babylonians, who set their sights on Jerusalem in 6th century BCE. The Jews weren't jazzed about submitting to a larger empire, but the Neo-Babylonians didn't take kindly to being denied. They sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and hauled off huge numbers of Judeans into exile. But then something amazing happened. The Persian ruler Cyrus the Great rose to power and allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. 71 years after the first temple's destruction, the second temple was open for business. Like its predecessor, the second temple was magnificent, especially once the Roman puppet king Herod started expansions in the 1st century BCE. But Herod's renovations didn't last very long, because history repeats. Another empire had its eye on Judea. And just as they had before, the Jews refused to submit. So in 70 CE, the Romans borrowed from the Babylonian playbook, burning Jerusalem, destroying the temple, and deporting Judeans to Rome in chains. In a final insult, the Romans used the Temple Mount as a garbage dump, literally. The Jews' holiest place, reduced for centuries to a heap of trash. All that was left of the once great temple included sections of the retaining walls. A small part of the western retaining wall became a site of Jewish pilgrimage and prayer, a symbol of both Jewish pride and Jewish tragedy. Why did Jews flock there? Why worship among refuse and ruins? Because it was never about the wall. The wall was merely the closest the Jews could get to the foundation stone, the holiest place on earth. So what changed? Who built this gorgeous dome behind me? That would be the Muslims. The holiest site in Islam is Mecca, which is a smooth 17-hour road trip if we get in the car right now. But the Prophet Muhammad didn't drive. According to Muslim tradition, he made the journey from Mecca to Jerusalem in a single night on the back of a magical winged creature called the Buraq. And from there, he ascended to heaven to meet and pray with the other prophets. So yeah, this site is a big deal for Muslims too. Islam spread quickly through the Levant, and by the 7th century, the Holy Land was part of the growing Arab Empire. To commemorate Muhammad's night journey, the Umayyad Caliph built this beautiful shrine behind me, right on top of where the Jewish temple's innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, had once stood, the center of the universe for Jews, the place where all three Abrahamic faiths agree that Abraham nearly sacrificed his son. Speaking of the Abrahamic faiths, you might have noticed I've been pretty silent about our other cousins, the Christians. So what's their relationship to the site? Roughly 500 years after Muhammad's night journey, Christian crusaders marched from Europe to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims. When the Crusaders encircled Jerusalem in 1099, the city's Muslims and Jews banded together to hold off the threat. But the Crusaders won the day, slaughtering thousands of Jews and Muslims and turned their holy sites into churches, including this one. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right there, for 88 years it served as the headquarters of the Knights Templar, but the Crusaders didn't hold Jerusalem for long. In 1187, Salah ad-Din routed the Christian forces, and the Temple Mount has been in Muslim hands ever since. Well, sort of. Because last I checked, the Temple Mount is in Jerusalem, the capital of the Jewish state, which brings us back to today. So who owns it now? Muslims or Jews? Like everything in the Middle East, it's complicated. Jews had been praying at the base of the Western Wall for 2,000 years, but as Jews returned to their homeland in the 1900s, Muslim authorities did their best to restrict Jewish access to the wall. Clerics whipped up their people with lies, claiming that the Jews were planning to take over and destroy Muslim holy sites. In August of 1929, after months of incitement, Arab mobs descended on the Jews of Jerusalem, Hebron, and Tzfat, massacring and mutilating over 133 Jews. The fight over this holy site has powered this conflict ever since. After Israel declared independence in May of 1948, the Arab world came calling, confident that they could stamp the tiny new state out of existence. As we know, they failed. But the old city, including the Jewish quarter, fell to the Jordanians, who pointedly ignored that pesky clause in the ceasefire agreement that guaranteed Jews access to their religious sites. From 1948 to 1967, no Jew could approach the Western Wall. All that changed when tensions exploded in 1967. The resulting war was brief, but it permanently altered the Middle East. Within 6 days, Israel dramatically expanded its borders and regained control of the old city. No Israeli alive then will ever forget the IDF Chief of Staff Motta Gur's announcement, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." My uncle Yoram was there that day. He had the honor of hanging the Israeli flag above the Western Wall on the Temple Mount. And he wasn't the only one overcome with joy. Within a week, 250,000 Jews had flocked to the wall. After 2,000 years of waiting, the Temple Mount was once again under Jewish control. Or was it? Muslims all over the world weren't too happy with the prospect of Jews controlling the Temple Mount. Plus, Jewish law has quite a lot to say about who's allowed to enter the complex and where they're allowed to go. Even in the days of the temples, ordinary Jews were barred from entering certain areas. This hadn't been an issue for 2,000 years. With the Temple Mount in Jewish hands once more, Israeli authorities had some decisions to make. The miraculous victory of 1967 had opened up a whole new world of complexity. Ultimately, Jewish tradition and Muslim pressure prevailed, and since 1967, Jews have not been allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. The only Jews regularly allowed on the sacred complex are soldiers and other security personnel, and for good reason. The mere hint of a change in the status quo can and has set the entire country ablaze. I've seen that tension firsthand. For almost 3 years, I served as a border policeman in the Israeli army, patrolling the Temple Mount and its surrounding neighborhoods. Under the leadership of my commanding officer, an Arab Muslim from Haifa, my unit protected worshippers of all ethnicities and faiths. Along with these innocent pilgrims, we were attacked too many times. But even the ugliest violence can't detract from the holiness of this place. As I know all too well, Israeli forces can enter the Temple Mount at any time for security reasons. But control and maintenance of the site ultimately rest with a Jordanian-funded Muslim trust known as the Jerusalem Islamic Waqf, which means that Judaism's holiest site is under the third holiest site in Islam, located in a territory controlled by Israel and entrusted to a Muslim religious organization that's funded by another country. Simple, right? Shocking that there's been any controversy here. The Waqf and the Israeli authorities have had some pointed disagreements over the years about everything from archaeological research to the presence of metal detectors. For example, in 1999, the Waqf decided to build an emergency exit in one of the mosques on the Temple Mount. Sounds fine, right? Safety first. Except they used bulldozers to clear an area 4 stories deep into the ground, carting away literal tons of soil embedded with ancient artifacts. As Israeli historian Eyal Meron put it, a toothbrush would be too large for brushing that soil, and they did it with bulldozers. You can guess what happened next. Jews accused the Waqf of destroying archaeological evidence of the ancient Jewish presence on the site. The Waqf's chief archaeologist responded by snapping, "Every stone is a Muslim development. If anything was destroyed, it was Muslim heritage." The controversy encapsulates the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the Temple Mount serving as shorthand for each side's legitimacy, a symbol of the worst kind of zero-sum thinking. It's like everyone is afraid to admit that the other side might have a historical claim or connection to the site, as though admitting someone else's connection somehow takes away from the validity of your own. Under that all or nothing mentality, there's literally no such thing as compromise. You're either a winner or you're a loser, and no one wants to be a loser, especially in the Middle East. That's why so many Palestinians refuse to admit that Jews have a claim to the site, ignoring mountains of historical evidence. In 1929, a Waqf historian wrote that it was beyond dispute that the Temple Mount was the site of Solomon's temple. Yet in 2010, the Palestinian Authority released a study claiming that the Kotel wasn't a Jewish holy site at all, but a part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Here's a quote: "This wall was never part of the so-called Temple Mount, but Muslim tolerance allowed for the Jews to stand in front of it and weep over its destruction." Nice, right? Do these guys write textbooks? I could stand here and laugh at the PA's blatant attempt to erase the inconvenient fact that the Jewish presence here predates the Arab Empire's conquest of Jerusalem by well over 2,000 years. But the PA's rhetoric, just like the rhetoric that incited the massacres of 1929, trickles down to ordinary folks with violent consequences. Today, Muslims and non-Muslims alike refer to the entire complex, not just the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as Al-Aqsa. These three syllables have served as a rallying cry, inciting Muslims against Jews. It's all Al-Aqsa, one young Arab man seethed during the 11-day war between Israel and Hamas in May of 2021. It's all Al-Aqsa. There it is, the whole conflict, stuffed into one 35-acre complex. So who owns the Temple Mount? I think that under the politics, under the wars, under the fighting, every Jew and every Arab would agree that there's only one true owner. But in the absence of a sign from heaven, it's our responsibility to figure out how to share this holy space.